Hi, I'm Micah Clark. Thank you for joining us today. As you see, I'm taping from home today. We had a power outage at our office yesterday when we were supposed to interview our guest today. I'm super excited about our guest. She is the editor of the Federalist. If you're not familiar with the Federalist, it's a news website that has over 100 million followers. It's a phenomenal site for conservative news and articles. I encourage you to go to Federalist.com. Their editor is a friend of mine, Joy Pullman, and she has written a phenomenal book. And I have to tell you, when I saw this book, that she was writing a book, I thought, well, we ought to interview her because she's a friend. And then I thought, well, I don't really want to read a book about homosexuality. I've read so many of those. And I'm telling you, folks, I cannot put this book down. This is a phenomenal book. The book is called False Flag. I'm going to try and hold it up here. Why Queer Politics Mean the End of America. And this is an amazing book. It really puts the pieces together. And it's timely, too, because on the day we're recording this, it's during the Olympics. We had the Last Supper outrage with the transgender people. Then we just had the boxer who was who was beaten. With 2 punches, she flagged out to protect herself. And there are people out there who think there's nothing wrong with men punching women in the face in the Olympics. I think it's very wrong. And so I'm so happy to have Joy on here. But I think what you're going to learn is these are simply not one-off events. They're not something that's, that's the fallen nature of man. That's where we are in society. I've often said that. I've said, I see something on TV or I see some homosexual commercial or something. And I think, well, that's just where we are in our culture with the fallen nature, sinful nature of man. I believe that's a mistake, having read the first 3 chapters of the book, and I can't wait. I just got it the other day. I can't wait to read the rest of it. This is a much more coordinated effort than you folks might realize. So, Joy, I'm so happy to have you on. It's good to see you again. Tell us, first of all, maybe why you wrote this book.
Thanks for having me on, Micah. I frankly wrote the book because I think that I'm in a position to say things that many other people think and feel, but they may sustain more career and personal damage if they do so. The publisher actually approached me after I had written an essay in the Federalist for last year's Pride Month, basically outlining the thesis of this book. But the idea behind it is that I guess I have kind of 2 sections in the book. The first half of the book looks at what I call a regime change inside the United States that really has been conducted, replacing our natural rights defending, limited government style, on paper constitution and the way of life that is necessary to make it possible. The way of life, of course, including, father-headed natural families. You can't really have self-government without that. So the first part of the book talks about kind of the governmental aspect of the regime change that's been occurring for the past 100 or so years inside the United States, replacing our original constitution and way of life with identity politics, communism, essentially. And then the second half of the book really looks at the kind of people that are required to have self-governing liberty sort of society, such as I think we have largely lost inside the United States. I really look at the connections between sexual chaos, whether it be, there's just, as we know, multiple varieties of it, whether it's, not being married before making a baby, whether it's breaking up your own marriage once you've formed it, whether it's, all these aspects of the queer movement and so forth. All of those forms of sexual chaos are absolutely related to people's inability to self-govern, right? They are psychological, emotional, and even spiritual outgrowths of disordered insides of people. And if you have people who are disordered, they're so disordered that it's so public that we can see people walking around cross-dressing. That is a very public form of it's projecting and putting outward the inner the disorder that people have. And the sort of people, the on average people who are acting out in those sorts of ways are not the kind of people that can sustain a self-governing republic. To have a self-government, you have to have people who control themselves, who plan for the future very long term, who restrain their energies, who are not likely to harm other people's rights. Basically, any time that you create a child without, having a married husband and wife to provide for that child long term, you are damaging the rights of other Americans because you're creating someone who's more likely to be a ward of the state. Because children who don't have their fathers and mothers married are most likely to be people who are, basically create a demand for big nanny government. So those are kind of the two halves of the book. And I really, I've long been a person who's really thought that there actually is not at all any dichotomy between the so-called economic or, foreign policy and so-called culture war family issues. Because human beings, we're not widgets. The sort of people that companies want to hire, bright, intelligent, hardworking people who show up on time, don't do drugs and all the rest. And, human beings don't just emerge like that from a vacuum. The most likely, way to get those kind of human beings is to have the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of children growing up in homes that are ordered, where their two parents are married and stay that way for life. And we're having less of those kinds of families. So therefore, it's no surprise that we have, people that are unemployable, barely employable, can't, rise through career directories, are clearly not paying more taxes than they're taking in, all the rest of the things. So I've always noticed, and believed that culture policy is economic policy, is foreign policy, because, your people absolutely are the core of your entire country, and everything that's going on in their lives ultimately is going to matter to those allegedly distended questions, such as tax policy and big government regulation and all the rest.
One of the things is let me start here, because in your subtitle and in your book, oftentimes you use the word queer, and I had always thought that was a slur, but I do know that the homosexual activists use that term often. And so it made me wonder, we used to say 20, 30 years ago when I was dealing with this issue, homosexual is somebody who's struggling with self-attraction, same-sex attraction. Gay is a political activist. But now gay just is kind of this universal term for everything. Is queer is there a distinction between homosexual and queer? Is queer a political activism term? Because it seems to be that when I read their materials and they use that term, it's not really a slur as much as it is a description of their radical activism.
Yeah, you're right about that. If you read homosexual, queer, gay material, their publications, that's long been for them a positive term. Just like the term gay, started out also as a slur, and now, like you mentioned, has become, the accepted term. In fact, it's more preferred among homosexual people than homosexual. But I actually just, partly chose to use the term because you can pronounce it, unlike LGBTQIAA. The acronym is not only unpronounceable, but it also is always changing. And I think queer is an umbrella term that includes whatever, people might at some point add to the mix. But I also think there is something important to, and actually absolutely that matters to the people who put themselves under that umbrella, their desire to, as they say, overturn heteronormativity, right? They say, so they use the word, they say they want to queer the curriculum. They want not just social studies, but math, science, every single art, every aspect that may be considered in a school curriculum. They want that affected by their sexual politics. They say that forthrightly, easy to find in the academic literature as well as in, K-12 curricula. But I actually think it's a really good umbrella term, but it also really goes us back to the people who are really pushing this movement. They say forthrightly that they do not want it to be normal to be heterosexual, which, by the way, as everyone knows, is the historic and current human norm by far. But they want to queer heteronormativity, they say. And what that really means is, if you think about it, what is the normal is what, at least 51% of people are doing, right? At least in kind of democratic sense. So if you want to end heteronormativity, that really means that queer people believe that they're on a recruiting mission. They believe that it is possible to alter people's sexual orientation, and they are forthrightly saying they want to do that. They want to get queerness to be the 50+1%, the majority, and that's really the only way that you can end heteronormativity, if you just think about that phrase for a second. So I think right there in that phrase is an amazing revelation of really what is going on. I don't think every single person who identifies as somewhere on the gender spectrum believes in all of this stuff, but the people who are teaching them what to do, who are defining for them what is what they should believe, what they should act like, they absolutely do believe what I've just said.
Well, and that's what I love about your book. It really is eye-opening about what kind of movement this is. This isn't just as I said, a degeneration with the fallen nature of man. As Christians, we know sin, has a progression. There is part of that in the behavior itself, but this is an active political movement, and you had there's so many great lines in this book. I've got this thing highlighted so much, it's unbelievable.
Oh, thanks.
It makes some. I mean, you're so good with words. I love your articles in Federalist. You're a great writer. You made a point: when a society focuses or elevates self-pleasure to its number one priority, it falls. In fact, you have a study, and I'd seen this years ago. I'm so glad it's in your book because I've lost it. But back in the 20s and 30s, there was a renowned sociologist who I think was the head of Harvard's Department of Sociology, who did a study going back 5,000 years of culture and found that when sexual pleasure is elevated to the top priority, cultures tend to fall. And I think we're seeing that now.
Yes, if I remember correctly, I think that was an Oxford sociologist.
Oxford,
but
okay.
It's in my book,
Okay.
so we can both look it up and make sure to, just... But I found that really interesting, and I think it absolutely matches. Anyone who has had a decent history education, I think one of the great things that history does for people is it gives you insights into human nature. And those absolutely should instruct how you deal with people in your everyday, as well as how you think about what time are we living in, what's likely to come next. Human behavior does follow patterns. It's not completely random. And so you're right. So when historically speaking, one of the words that, for example, the famous historian Jacques Barzin, he used to call it is, decadence, right? His famous historical work is, I believe, from Dawn to Decadence, talking about Western civilization. But, major empires, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, many of the Western civilizations across Europe, the Russian Empire, they follow a trajectory, and when they hit the decadent stage, things start to fall apart. And one of the signs, I forget which ancient Roman historian this is, but he commented, for example, on the childless women carrying around their tiny little dogs because they had the dogs instead of having children, right? So, and again, I'm pro pet, but we absolutely do see that people today do have pets instead of children. And so that's yet another symbol of people instead of, and you can see kind of this in kind of a miniature version just within the family itself. People who marry and have children are directing their sexual energies into productivity, right? They are creating children, they're creating a home, they're creating a life, and they, in the process of doing that, right? I'm a mom. It's the greatest sacrifice in my, that I ever could have had to make in my life, and I think pretty much everyone who's a parent would agree with that statement. But I actually say that in a positive way, right? It is maybe the number one thing throughout human history that has made people better versions of themselves, driven them onward to higher virtue, because you have to become a better person to give up your own comfort for the good of another human being. Children are defenseless. My husband and I, we brought our children into this world. We are responsible for them, so we have to make sure as best that we can that they can survive and become decent human beings as adults. It's our responsibility. So you can just think about, the sexual energies is super powerful. It's always been through. It's always driven great art, for example, music, literature, song. But when people, so harnessed and put into productive directions, you have cultural flourishing with that sexual energy. But if people dissipate their sexual energy, they're pleasuring themselves only, they never sacrifice on behalf of another with that sexual energy. They're not creating families. They're just trying to think, how can I get more comfortable? Well, then you become, both economically and culturally what the, statistician, the economist Nicholas Eberstadt calls a nation of takers. You do have the mindset among people shifted from how do I give to others, how do I serve others, how do I make things better for the future, to I'm getting out of this whatever I can, me, I'm the center of the world, I'm all that matters. And those kind of people are takers, right? I just ask all of our listeners, right, while I'm sure we all have that impulse to be a taker rather than a giver, what kind of, neighborhood would you want to live in, right? One that's primarily made of people who are willing to sacrifice their own comfort for the good of other people? Or would you like to live in a neighborhood where people were willing to sacrifice other people's well-being for their own comfort? I think the answer there is obvious. And decent civilizations used to encourage self-sacrifice for good, for the good of other people, for the good of all. And now we've really lost that ethos, and the rise in selfishness and self-centeredness absolutely comes along with the refusal to direct sexual energies into production and simply into personal comfort and dissipation is exactly what's going on here.
I about fell on my chair this week when Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg was campaigning for Kamala Harris this week. And he made the statement, and I couldn't believe they said it out loud because I've thought this for decades. And he said, abortion makes men more free. Well, yeah, it makes irresponsible men more free. Abortion is the best thing for a man who wants to just get what he can get from a woman, doesn't pay for a child,
and he's willing to kill a human being for that.
Yes.
That to me, whoa.
Yes.
That the openness of that, because I thought a lot about the abortion effect on our culture, and really what's behind that is I will kill someone for my own pleasure. Mm-hmm. Wow, that's where we are. That's where many of our fellow Americans are.
One of the things that surprised me in this book, and I thought I was on top of a lot of things, there was a court case called Bostock, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And you compare it to as being as big as Roe versus Wade. And I think I remember when it happened, but I had no idea until I read your book how pervasive and how influential that horrible decision was with Roberts and Gorsuch. Kind of surprised me too. And then the four people who, as you say, hate the Constitution joined. And tell our audience about Bostock and how the Biden administration has implemented that since it was ruled on by the Supreme Court.
Right, so that was a 2015 Supreme Court decision that I basically call the Roe versus Wade of queer politics. And what that did was basically say that anywhere, I should be precise. Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion, and as you say, was joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, he claimed that they were only deciding that the word sex in federal discrimination law can be expanded to include the concept of gender identity in Title VII or employment claims. So, that sounds a little, but basically what Neil Gorsuch wanted to do was say, look, this decision should only apply to the area of law that the court case about it covers, which happened to be in an employment case. I believe it was an employee of a funeral home wanted to cross-dress as a woman at work. And the Supreme Court said that the funeral home had to allow this employee to cross-dress and be interacting with grieving people, as a man wearing a dress, like they had to be foisted upon him. In that intimate and uncomfortable, already difficult situation, then you've got to encounter, a man with a dress maybe handling, your relative during such a sensitive time. Anyhow, so Neil Gorsuch basically in that decision did I quote one of the lawyers for the ACLU, another transsexual, saying basically we pre-wrote the decision for Neil Gorsuch and he took everything that we fed directly to him because they thought he was going to be the swing vote. And boy, he just did exactly what they wanted. He just lapped it up. So what they had wanted him to do was what the Obama administration had started and now under Biden has been continuing apace, is basically anywhere in federal law, which there are, as the dissenters in the Bostock decision point out, there's more than 100 federal laws that contain some kind of provision saying that you can't discriminate by sex. And so the transgender activists have been saying, well, discrimination by sex, which formerly was only understood to be for women, right? You have to basically admit women to colleges equally. You have to, consider them for jobs equally, all the rest. They said transsexuals should be basically added to that category of getting federal protections, even though none of the lawmakers passing any of those 100 laws ever considered, that they were saying, yes, you have to hire transsexuals at the same rate as women and all the rest. So without basically their goal there, which was successfully accomplished by a very ignorant and naive Neil Gorsuch, was to, without ever an act of Congress, go ahead and write every single federal anti-discrimination law against women. So feminist laws were immediately transformed into transsexual gender identity laws. So maybe your listeners are aware of what are called SOGI laws, sexual orientation and gender identity laws. What the Bostock decision basically did was insert into 100 federal laws SOGI provisions that never had been ever considered by the legislatures that actually passed those laws. It was a complete legislation from the bench, just putting, transsexual protections and preferences into federal law against the clear intent and wishes of the people who actually passed those laws. So while Neil Gorsuch tried to limit that decision only to employment, he should have known that the Biden administration would do exactly what it went on to do when it got into office, was to cite Bostock and then go through every single area of federal law, every federal agency, every guidance, and start saying, look, the Supreme Court has legitimized swapping out the word sex to include gender identity and dysphoria. So anywhere that there are special federal preferences for women, now there are also special federal preferences for transgender individuals. And so this is basically how, feminist law paved the way for gender identity and sexual and transsexual preferences to be stuck right into federal law without any decision from any elected representative. So the Biden administration has gone on to say, since the law says you can't have sex discrimination, for example, in school lunches, in accepting SNAP benefits, so basically food welfare programs, they have gone and applied that same concept to every single area the federal government touches, which is basically every area of American life at this point, right? There's an agency, there's a regulation for pretty much any sector of the economy or even private life. And so all of that, was basically passed with the stroke of the pen by, a very foolish Supreme Court justice who decided that he ought to be above the law because, his sympathies were very clearly with transsexual activists who overrode, the will of all those Congresses and state legislatures who actually said, there might be reasons to not want to have a transsexual employee, let's say, sizing women for bras, or maybe you don't want to have a homosexual, Boy Scout leader or supervisor of little boys in showers, just the same as you wouldn't have a man supervising little girls in showers. They're sexually attracted to them. This used to be common sense, basic human understanding. I mean, I would argue the same thing, of course, applies to women. There's some jobs that men are better at women at doing. Probably also vice versa, right? Like I pick my OBGYNs, I prefer females, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And the same thing, there's some jobs for which, men are a better choice than women. For one of the reasons being, right, that they don't have babies, and so therefore they're not going to jet off for 6-week to 6-month maternity leave if you have a critical job you really can't sustain that in. So, but, our Congress has for many, many years taken all those decisions away from individuals and said, you're a horrible bigot if you ever make a common sense decision like that. And what that's gotten us is transing every single area of federal power, which is pretty much all of American life at this point.
Well, what this has led to, and if you want to say more about this, and we've seen this, is the churches and Christian charities or religious charities, Catholic charities, are losing federal contracts. Well, they're having been forced to choose between their faith and doing their job or doing their mission with this federal money. And we're talking $700 billion, you said, in transfers funds that this could affect. It's affecting Christian schools. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you like, about how, because we constantly see this conflict between sexual anarchy and religious virtues.
That's a great point. Right. So basically any place that you have a SOGI law, what it does is infringes on people's First Amendment rights. I have a chapter in the book that goes through all of the Bill of Rights and shows how, transgender identity politics laws mangle all of them. But very clearly people, I think, are pretty well aware of the clear First Amendment problems. For one thing, it is a speech violation, right? So, for example, the federal government using Bostock as a pretense has imposed on federal employees as well as visitors to federal agencies pronoun rules, right? They've said that if you come into HHS as a visitor, you have to call men women. You have to say, he is a she, and so on and so forth. They've said, and they've attached these sorts of criteria to all of the federal funding, which I note in the book. There is a massive portion of the economy that is basically, federal funding dependent, right? There's also a massive portion of the economy that's state funding dependent. But we, at this point, I was actually thinking about when writing that chapter, like at what point, are we already past the tipping point where the majority of economic activity is controlled by the government? So AKA we don't even have a free economy anymore. I think we might be past that point. But I'm not an economist, so I didn't get into that in the book. But I do point out, that beyond just the massive amount of direct government spending and transfer payments, things like Medicaid, Medicare, food stamps, huge amounts of health spending. But then there's all these federal contracts that they apply all of these rules to as well. So if you are a contractor with the federal government for roads, you're building a federal highway. If you are a military contractor, maybe you're even just like a tech guy, right? Building or maintaining a website, for some federal agency. You have to adhere to, these rules that say you have to call men women. You have to, have your bathrooms transgender. There's, no female only, male only bathrooms anymore. And many private schools, for example, they participate in the federal school lunch program, one of the entities affected by this. So the federal government has been trying to deny participation in school lunch program to private Christian schools, saying Christians equal bigots, therefore Christians cannot participate in any federal contract funding, which is clearly unconstitutional. But that's the whole point here. I mean, as I point out in the first half of my book, these identity politics laws overturn the Constitution. They circumvent it, they flip it on its head, and they end all the protections of the original Constitution and Bill of Rights, and they erect a new totalitarian government that believes it can control even the private thoughts and speech that you have inside your own home.
We're talking with Joy Pullman, editor of the Federalist. She has a new book out called False Flag. I would encourage you to look this up on Amazon, or if there's another place before we go, I'll let you ask Joy where we should buy it, but that's where I got it. Fabulous book. I look forward to reading the rest of it, and it really is one of the best current events books I've read in years. So, Joy, we've gotten probably to the point where I've read. Tell us a little bit about the rest of the book and where you head in that for our audience.
Well, I think it's very important for people to start thinking about the kind of upstream causes of transgenderism, because I think a lot of people, they saw the explosion, and I call it transgender pornography because that's really what it is, right? Cross-dressing in front of children and putting out fake, let's say, female body parts right under their noses, that's pornographic. It just straight up is. So having that splashed across every single media outlet in an attempt, right after the Obergefell decision, and in an attempt to push the Supreme Court and other lawmakers in the direction they have gone, that seemed to a lot of people to have happened really, really suddenly, and people did not expect us to go straight from, okay, all the states are required to issue homosexual marriage certificates, to bam, now we have to have men, cross-dressing men with fake, fake female body parts teaching kindergartners, which now is happening, in public schools anywhere. We've published on that in the Federalist. Some 8-year-old kid walks into his classroom, substitute teacher is a tranny, right? Public school. That could happen because, if you don't hire the tranny for your public school classroom, you're a bigot, right? Under these new rules. So that seems to have been very sudden to people, but I actually don't think, I show in the book how it's been building for a very, very long time. And I think something that's really important, especially for people on the right, to reassess. I know that a lot of your listeners, are cultural conservatives like me, probably faith-based like both of us. And, but I think, it's important in this moment to reassess the kind of ways that we have given ground as a culture to the lie that men and women are interchangeable. So, in the book, I trace the precedents to transgenderism to feminism. And again, I grew up in a Christian home, very conservative politically, was helping pro-life resource centers from the time I was in middle school, very, very faithful, devout family. And I still, personally had, as through college and marriage, to really work on my innate feminist tendencies, which I don't even know where I got them right growing up in that sort of environment. But the idea, I had still, believed the idea that, men and women are basically the same, at least, professionally speaking. And it took having babies while being, while working to think, maybe there's something different about men and women, and it really matters, and the babies really need me. And I really had no idea that this was coming. I know a lot of people have been like that. So I think while the transgender issue is really shocking, it's really crazy and wild, there are a lot of places in which we've granted the premise on which it's built, especially among the right, by pretending that men and women are completely interchangeable, and being all onto this sort of feminist, like honestly, like tacitly anti-man, like girl power sort of stuff, which again, I think. Giving birth to children was the most empowering thing that I've ever done, the strongest I've ever had to be. Men can't, right? So, and that was the moment, of course, that there's, the moment of my strength was entirely female in my own life, right? And nobody ever talked about that or prepared me for that. So I really think, coming back to the book, I talk a lot about how the acceptance of divorce, the pretending like it does not traumatize children, the kind of brushing it under the rug, the refusal to accept that male and female differences matter a lot more than just have pop a baby out 2 weeks later, go back to the office. That's an inhumane way of treating women, but that's been the standard for women for the past 70 years. And for many women, I've heard from them telling me that. So the second half of the book really looks at kind of the interpersonal, the familial, the trauma connections, the psychological sort of consequences, and backs up and looks at how transgenderism absolutely is an expression of psychological chaos and trauma in people's lives. And I really think people on the right, we have pregnancy centers that are wonderful at helping mothers, who are really needy, who they're affirming life, that give practical help. I think an area where we could work on and build up is trying to offer resources to people who are gender distressed, and to really develop good counseling and psychological resources for people. And I think somewhere that we really could develop is helping families through difficult times and helping rediscover, that the biological differences for men and women matter to our relationships with each other. They matter to our family life, to relationships between husband and wives. And we should be able to talk about that with a lot less of the just like defensiveness that is often present, because, if a sort of premise that you have can result in children, slitting their wrists, all the way from the wrist to their elbow, cutting off that skin and making a fake, let's say, male member to try to remain PG rated here on this family program. Maybe it's time that we should start investigating that and what causes that, and try to be reaching out and helping and have preventative care and behaviors in our own families and communities, because that really expresses a lot of suffering and pain. And wouldn't it be better if we could really meet a lot of people and help them with that trauma and that pain, so that gender distress, becomes is no longer seems like something that will actually help them, but they can get something that is legitimately relieving their obvious suffering.
Well, we've seen studies among transgenders that if they are not given puberty blockers, if puberty is allowed to happen, the overwhelming majority of them will identify with the sex they were born with, if they're not indoctrinated and given these horrible drugs. What you were saying something, I've said this a lot. Something really in my marriage happened. It changed everything. Of course, when you get married, you see gender differences between your wife and your spouse. My wife and I, when we had kids, it was like God opened my eyes. It was the most beautiful thing I think I'd ever seen. I suddenly saw my wife in a totally different way, because I saw how she interacted to my daughter first and then my son as a woman, and how I interacted with my son and daughter as a man, and how they reacted to me as a man. I mean, if my son wanted to go play football, he asked me. When my son wanted compassion, he asked his mom a lot of times. Or my daughter will talk to my wife in a totally different way than she talks to me. She comes home from youth group and talks about this and that and notices all these things. It's all about their relational stuff, and my son wants to talk about sports. And it's a beautiful thing. It is so neat to see how important gender is to your children and how it is to your marriage. And it's just, I thought I knew that, but until I had kids, I had no idea how important that was.
And I actually think the fact that we're getting to we now have the most unmarried adults as in American history, unlikely that, the majority of them, unfortunately, will find someone. I wish they would, because it is it makes people so much more happy throughout their whole life. But I think that absolutely plays a part here, because like you said, it's within families. When as a daughter, I interact with my father. As a girl, I interact with my brothers. I learn things about men from, the men that I'm in a family with. If you don't have a father, if you don't have brothers, if families are a smaller size, if you don't have uncles and grandparents, families are not only not forming, there are far fewer children. Mary Eberstadt points this out in some of her wonderful books. Just even the reductions in family size and the increase in space between people gives you fewer interactions with the opposite sex in non-sexual contexts, right? So I'm not on the dating market with any of my male relatives, so I can learn about them, and it helps you prepare for marriage, and it helps you understand, again, how to relate to the other sex in a non-sexual way, which you'll need for the workplace, for any volunteer activity that you do. And so it's reducing people's interpersonal skills by, if you degrade the family. And so that also, I think, plays a factor in the gender dysphoria, because then what's replacing real life knowledge and interaction with people of both sexes for people is just the images that they see on the screen, which are made up, artificial, propagandized images. So you're eliminating the real life context and information and tutorials that people used to get from those family interactions, and you're replacing it with this artificial garbage, on TikTok, on YouTube. The research, really is very clear that increased time on screen media also makes children more likely to identify as queer, right? So, so they're consuming all of this media that's lying to them about, you can just be a man by just adopting a macho pose, and speaking more gruffly, having short hair. But if you'd ever actually interacted with men, like you say, you understand, oh, wow, do I really want to throw myself around on a football field and hurtle my body into other people? No, I mean, for most women, that's really not their keenest interest, right? So, so you understand it's a lot more than cosmetic changes. There's just innate differences between the sexes that you would understand through experience, but you never have that experience. So I think that also plays a factor in this dysphoria here.
Well, I've kept you for quite a while. I know you're busy. How would you like to close this interview? Is there anything you want to leave readers with? And also, I mentioned Amazon just because that's where I bought your book. Is there a source you'd prefer people to buy your book through? Because I really encourage people to buy your book, False Flag. It is a thought-provoking read. You take your highlighter. It's a great book. Really is. I don't say that about every book. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. But where would you like the audience to get your book?
Well, were you able to find it easily on Amazon? Because I had some people within the first couple weeks of release, they couldn't find it by searching both my name and the name of the book. And it's the only book with that title that is a political book. So it should have come up immediately, and they weren't able to find it. So as long as people can find it easily there, I don't care where you buy it, it benefits me. If people search my name, Joy Pullman, in the Federalist, and you find my bio there, I have a link to the bookshop.org place you can buy it. But like I said, as long as folks can find it, anywhere is great.
Well, it's a book you want to buy. You want to pass around to people. It'd be a great book for pastors, I think for state legislators. I wish every state legislator would read this book, because I think they know there's things going on. I don't think they realize what a coordinated effort is going on to make this happen in America. But before we go, let me ask you this, and I mentioned this briefly. Tell us about the Federalist and the work you do for the Federalist, because it is a phenomenal site. I've used a lot of the articles from there, but maybe a lot of our people don't know about it. Tell us about the Federalist.
Well, it's at thefederalist.com. We have a large and growing team of reporters who bring you basically counter-narrative, factual, reliable information, as well as some fun articles. We have, before other right sites started picking up on it, we were the original place where people could find, humorous commentary on sports, random water cooler topics, talking about, what other parents are into. We have commentary on, the hottest, YouTube or TikTok, videos or ads, or like you mentioned the Olympics. We were all over that, like What on Water, when the Last Supper parody or, bigotry event occurred. Right. So we, our tagline is religion, politics, and culture. So we like to talk a lot about the intersection of that. And we have especially, on top of all of our just general, life interests that we sometimes write about. I would say, one of our top edges has been reporting on both the, for example, the Spygate, the administrative state's attempts to sabotage rule by the people, democratic elected rule. And right now, we have our team is very heavily focused on election integrity going into 2024. So for original, accurate, responsible reporting on things that people on the right really care about and can't get a lot of good information on, that's why we exist.
Well, and I'll just say this: we're a 501c3. We don't endorse candidates, but if this issue concerns you, there is a huge difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on this issue. And so I would encourage people to investigate that. You saw that with the Olympic response. Don't know where RFK is on this, but this book is very timely for the upcoming election, because how the election goes will either slow this down or speed it up. So the book is called False Flag. Our guest today is, there we go, Joy Pullman, editor of the Federalist. I encourage you to buy this book, pass it on to your pastor or to a legislator or to other people. But the book is called False Flag by Joy Pullman. Joy, it's great to see you again. And thank you for joining us today. I know how busy you are, so I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I hope that was helpful today. I appreciate you joining us. I'm so excited about this book. It's very important. It's very timely. The book is called False Flag by Joy Pullman. Please check it out on Amazon or at Federalist.com. Buy this book. You'll be glad you did. It's worth every penny. I'm Micah Clark with the American Family Association of Indiana. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great weekend.